Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on HRES 927.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
So ordered.
It depends on the context. This was the testimony delivered by so-called prestigious university presidents when presented with the question, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate your campus bullying and harassment policies? The context. What a disgraceful legalistic answer from academia's supposed top minds. As chairwoman of the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, I'll tell you what never depends on the context. Defending the rights of Jewish students to feel safe on campus. Condemning calls to incite violence against the world's most persecuted ethnic group is always appropriate and never depends on the context. And holding smug university elites accountable never depends on the context. That's why I rise today in support of this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose is the gentleman is recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield myself such time as I may consume.
So ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I condemn anti-Semitism in all forms. Moreover, calls for genocide of Jewish people has no place in reasonable discourse, and I condemn that too. I don't think such a statement would be necessary, but in today's context, it is necessary. These sentiments were shared repeatedly by Claudine Gay of Harvard, Sally Kornbluth from MIT, and Elizabeth McGill from the University of Pennsylvania during their testimony last week. Unfortunately, because of the 5-minute exchange towards the end of the hearing that was clipped and shared online without full context during the hours-long hearing, these university presidents' commitment to fighting anti-Semitism has been called into question. This is because during the clip, they answered the question asked. They made the mistake of believing the hearing was a serious attempt to ascertain what could be done to promote student safety on campus in light of the tension between the First Amendment protections of freedom of speech on the one hand and the Criminal Code, Title VI, and Campus Code of Conduct on the other. Some speech, such as threats, can be so severe as to be criminal. Other speech could establish a hostile environment on campus in violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Universities can establish codes of conduct prohibiting some speech while respecting the First Amendment. But any speech involved in the First Amendment analysis is likely to be reprehensible. The fact that it might be protected does not make the speech any less reprehensible, and does not suggest that you even agree with it. A call for genocide of Jewish people is obviously reprehensible in all contexts, but whether or not it is constitutionally protected depends on context. Don't take my word for it. Read the article published recently in the Harvard Crimson, authored by Harvard law professor Charles Fried, formerly Solicitor General during the Reagan administration. In the article, Professor Fried states, and I quote, "When asked whether they would discipline students, or I suppose faculty, if they called for genocide of Jews, each president responded that the answer depends on the context of the utterance." He goes on by saying, "I've taught at Harvard Law School since 1961 and began practicing before the Supreme Court in 1985, 4 years as Solicitor General of the United States, and I would have felt professionally obligated to answer as the presidents did. It does depend on context." In the 1969 Brandenburg v. Ohio Supreme Court ruled unanimously the Constitution guarantees free speech and free press do not permit a state to forbid or prescribe advocacy of the use of force or law violation, except where such advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and likely to incite or promote such action. He continues that speech itself indeed is well protected. The three university presidents head private institutions that are not bound by every aspect of the federal constitutional restraints, but each institution in various ways has declared itself committed to protecting the First Amendment values over the years. So it is not surprising that their presidents would have answered that whether they would discipline or expel students for advocating genocide depends on the context. If one seeks to follow constitutional principles, answering this question certainly does depend on context. That's what Professor Freed said. That is the kind of analysis applied to any freedom of speech question. It's even being applied to former President Trump today. Was his speech on January 6, 2021, a crime of inciting violence, or was it protected speech? Incredibly, the university presidents were directed to give a one-word answer, yes or no, and they responded, as Professor Freed said he would have been professionally obligated to do, it depends on context. Regrettably, they took the question as an opportunity to seriously discuss the constitutional implications of a complex question. That was a big mistake. And for that mistake, we are considering a resolution to condemn them and ask them to resign. I also think it's important to put this resolution in context, because in 2017, after white supremacists walked through the campus of University of Virginia shouting, "Jews will not replace us," Democrats on the committee requested a hearing on that incident, and nothing happened. Meanwhile, the one who declared there were good people on both sides has been enthusiastically endorsed. We need to do everything the law allows to address anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, homophobia, and other forms of discrimination on college campuses. This resolution is not a serious effort to advance that cause. I therefore oppose this resolution and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from New York, Conference Chairwoman, Ms. Stefanik.
Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Chairwoman Fox for chairing last week's important hearing. There is a reason that last week's hearing, the university presidents of Harvard, Penn, and MIT made history as the most watched congressional testimony in history with over 1 billion views. And that's because their testimony was the most morally bankrupt testimony in the history of the United States Congress. When asked the very specific question, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate your code of conduct on bullying and harassment, the world watched and the world heard their answers in horror. As the president of Harvard, the president now former of Penn, and the president of MIT equivocated, dehumanized, and failed to answer yes. Anyone with a sliver of decency, humanity, and morality knows that the answer to that question is yes. President Kornbluth of MIT said that such depravity would only be considered harassment depending on the, quote, context. When pressed during her questioning, Penn's president, now former President McGill's response was shocking to the extreme. Quote, if the speech becomes conduct, it can be harassment. Finally, Harvard President Gay, whose answer was the same, quote, it depends on the context. It was pathetic, amoral, and inhumane, and by God, the world heard it. And as I said in the hearing, it does not depend on the context. As attacks against Jewish students have skyrocketed on campuses across America, we clearly have tremendous work ahead of us, Mr. Speaker, to address this rot of anti-Semitism that is now rooted in our once premier higher education institutions, and we will not be deterred by this important work. This is why I rise today in support of my bipartisan resolution condemning the rise of anti-Semitism on university campuses around the country and the morally bankrupt testimony of those university presidents.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
I give the gentlewoman another 30 seconds.
It is only a first step, but it is an important step. I commend my colleagues, Congressman Moskowitz, Majority Leader Scalise, and Congressman Gottheimer for joining to lead this historically important bipartisan effort to stand for moral truth. And I yield back the balance to the chairwoman.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Manning.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank my friend, the gentleman from Virginia, Ranking Member Scott, for recognizing me. Mr. Speaker, as someone who has dedicated most of her career to combating anti-Semitism and as the co-chair of the House Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, I know well that anti-Semitism has been on the rise in our country for years. It was a growing problem before the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack, and sadly, immediately after that savage attack, anti-Semitism has skyrocketed, particularly on college campuses. What we have seen happening on college campuses is outrageous, and too many college and university leaders have totally failed in their moral responsibility to condemn anti-Semitism. They have failed to keep Jewish students and faculty members safe. That is shameful. And yes, I was appalled by the failure of the 3 college presidents to simply say yes. A call for the genocide of Jews is wrong, period. But I have no interest in meaningless resolutions that do nothing to address the underlying issue of anti-Semitism. That's why my colleagues should join us in crafting serious bipartisan legislation that will make a real difference. We don't need throwaway resolutions. We need effective solutions. If we're serious about fighting anti-Semitism, we need legislation to implement and codify the U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. We need to pass the President's request for $200 million in emergency supplemental funding for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. We need to fully fund the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, not to cut that funding. And we need to strengthen our federal civil rights laws to punish all universities that fail to protect Jewish students. Until we do that, non-binding, politically motivated resolutions are not worth the paper they're written on. When anti-Semitism rears its ugly head, it harms us all, and it eats at the foundations of our democracy. I have always called out anti-Semitism on the left and on the right, and I will continue to do so. But I don't want just words. I want this Congress to take action and pass implementing legislation. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, member of the Committee on Education and Workforce, Joe Wilson.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you, Chairwoman Virginia Fox, a former college president yourself, who understands these issues. And I'm very grateful for Republican Conference Chairwoman Elise Stefanik, who is courageously leading this resolution that condemns anti-Semitism on university campuses. Most Americans are shocked at the insane campus anti-Semitism that has developed, and I reviewed this in a lead op-ed in the Washington Times, December the 7th. My analysis was, sadly, college campuses have descended from coveted citadels of intellectual freedom to illiberal sewers of intolerance and bigotry. Diversity and inclusion are a George Orwell 1984 implementation, excluding conservative thought. Over the years, as infantile leftists hire only other infantile leftists, the most extreme even hire more extreme as each tries to do the other in leftism. This leads to today's suicidal derangements, even as the regime in Tehran, coordinating with war criminal Putin, develops missiles for a nuclear attack on the big Satan, America, which would vaporize college campuses. The solution for closed-minded intolerance on campuses is obvious. To liberate academia from denial of free speech, there should be the inclusion and diversity of more conservative academics overcoming today's blatant discrimination. All Americans in good faith want college education to be uplifting for students to achieve the American dream, and I look forward to working with my colleague, Congresswoman Manning. This should be bipartisan. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield one and a half minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, a member of the Committee on Education and Workforce, Mr. Grothman.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Thank you. Like most Americans, I happen to be in the room because I'm on the committee, and was a little bit startled and stunned by the lack of concern for rampant anti-Semitism on the most prominent universities in this country, the leaders who were chosen to lead those universities. And we have to ask ourselves, why is it happening on our premier campuses? You know, I can go in Wisconsin, all the hard workers in the factories, all the hard workers on the farms, all the people working in retail. I don't see any evidence of this. As a matter of fact, I don't think there's anywhere in the state of Wisconsin I'd go and find this sort of thing. But nevertheless, we seem to be finding it on our universities. And the question is, why is that so? And is there anything out there would give an indication that you have a possibility of anti-Semitism? Part of it, I think, is coming from recent immigrants who are carrying grievances from long ago to the United States. But the more concerning one is the spoiled upper middle classes that make up so many of the college students and the professors that make up the college students. And I think what we're coming out of is what I'll call the bored upper middle classes looking for something to do, and the unhappiness out of that boredom that leads them to be anti-American, but also anti-Semitic and anti-Israel, because when they see Palestine, the Gaza and Israel, they see one successful Western country and they see an unsuccessful, crooked country, and it leads them to be so mentally muddled up that they can't see what's wrong with the horrific murders that took place. So in any event, I condemn this. Thank you.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve. I have an additional speaker coming, but he's not here yet.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from California, a member of the Committee on Education and Workforce, Mr. Kiley.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
For nearly 4 centuries, Harvard has been known for many great things. As America's first college, as the alma mater of 8 presidents, as the most fertile of ground for new ideas and cutting-edge research. Yet now, in this moment, Harvard has become known for a truly terrible thing, for anti-Semitism, for leading a 21st century American resurgence of one of the world's most ancient and retrograde prejudices. And this is in large part because of the words and action, as well as the silence and inaction of President Claudine Gay. We have all now seen the shocking testimony from last week. But to borrow a phrase from Dr. Gay, we need to also look at the context of Harvard having the very worst ranking in the entire country for protecting free speech. The context of President Gay initially refusing to condemn the Hamas terrorist attack and then refusing to condemn the student groups that blamed Israel. The context of Harvard's woefully inadequate measures to protect Jewish students both before October 7th, but especially after, to the point that at the hearing, President Gay would refuse to even answer the question as to whether a Jewish student can feel safe and welcome on her campus. That Harvard has declined to remove President Gay even after Penn forced out its president speaks volumes about the singular failures of that university. Yet Harvard also offers a broader window into what ails higher education in our country. This is a moment of reckoning for American higher education. Our universities cost too much, deliver too little value to graduates, and have become the most intolerant places in American life. Now is the time for fundamental change to reform the American university, and this resolution is a first step. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Chairman of the Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education Subcommittee, Mr. Bean.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Gentleman is from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Speaker, we have seen the evil and hatred of anti-Semitism find its voice across American college and university campuses, and we have seen the full force of Jewish hatred grow as student organizations continue to celebrate the horrific October 7th terrorist attacks. These institutions have become hate factories that are quick to allow the spread of anti-Semitism, but slow to condemn it, if at all. Harvard President Claudine Gay even said calling for the genocide of Jewish students depends on the context when it comes to violating the university's code of conduct. Let me be clear. Today, the faces of modern anti-Semitism in American education are Harvard, UPenn, MIT. These institutions have gone from elite to elitist. At Harvard, if you use the wrong pronouns, that's a violation of their code of conduct. But violently targeting Jewish students and calling for the genocide of the Jewish people, that's acceptable Harvard conduct. The history of the Holocaust reminds us what will happen when hatred is met by silence. We cannot stand by while students feel threatened. It's more than a discussion, Mr. Speaker. It's a call to action, and that's why I'm proud to support Representative Stefanik's resolution condemning anti-Semitism in institutions of higher learning and specifically condemning Presidents McGill, Gay, and Kornbluth for failing to denounce the calls for genocide on their campuses. 17 times it was asked, 17 times they failed the question. Mr. Speaker, it bears repeating, anti-Semitism is not activism. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, a member of the Committee on Education and Workforce, Mr. Wahlberg.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I thank you, gentlelady. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of HRES 927. Last week, America watched in bewilderment as the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn were unable to say if calls for a genocide of Jews violated their harassment and bullying policy. Let's not forget campus leaders go after microaggressions, but suddenly, when it comes to anti-Semitism, they chose to remain silent. At that same hearing, I asked Harvard's president how she could rectify cracking down on faculty for saying there are biologically two genders, but maintain that calling for genocide is protected speech. The reality is, at these universities, free speech only applies to certain people at certain times, which is why these schools rank at the bottom of scorecards that judge freedom of speech. The inability of these presidents to condemn anti-Semitic rhetoric only encourages further harassment and jeopardizes the safety of Jewish students and ultimately all. They need to be held to account. I encourage adoption of the resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman for Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, could I inquire as to how much time is remaining?
Gentlewoman has 8.5 minutes remaining.
And Mr. Scott?
Gentleman from Virginia has 11 and a half minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 1 minute.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, anti-Semitism on college campuses incident tracking from 2019 to 2023. 659 total reported anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses since October 7, a 700% increase compared to last year. This was updated on December 13th, 2023. Since the terrorist attack on Israel by Hamas on October 7th, anti-Semitic incidents against Jewish students on college campuses have reached alarmingly high rates, increasing by 700% over the same period last year. Hillel International has been working around the clock with our partners to report with their partners to address these incidents and to ensure that all Jewish students feel safe on campus. This is coming from a report from Hillel, which I would like to enter into the record, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection, the gentlewoman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, a member of the Committee on Education and the Workforce, Mr. Williams.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I thank Representative Stefanik, my colleague from New York, for introducing this much-needed resolution. With issues as critical as mitigating anti-Semitism and protecting our Jewish community, it is vital that we speak today with moral clarity. Just days ago, in a hearing in the House Education and Workforce Committee, we heard shocking testimony from the presidents of what were once our most esteemed educational institutions. Each one of these institutions have more than 100 years of history educating our youth. One, Harvard University, is closing in on 400 years of history. These schools have an embarrassment of riches, billions of dollars in annual revenue, much of it from federal funds, billions more in endowments, no, tens of billions of dollars in endowments. They have the resources to reach any educational goal. When pressed on the solution to the problem of anti-Semitism, each of them testified that education was, in fact, the solution. Education is supposed to be the solution to anti-Semitism. Yet with all of that history, with all of those resources, with the esteem of our society and the world, these universities are ground zero for rampant, virulent, obscene, and inhuman anti-Semitism. The hearings last week exposed not only the lack of moral leadership at these schools, it exposed a sickness in the culture of our elite universities. If calling for the murder and genocide of fellow students for the crime of being Jewish is not immediately and completely repugnant, then there is no moral compass at the heart of these institutions. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose this resolution, which, to my knowledge, would mark the first time in American history that the House of Representatives would vote to tell private college and university presidents to resign. And I want all of my colleagues to think very seriously about what this means for us today and in the future. We're all profoundly disturbed by the resurgence of anti-Semitism and racism in campus towns, including death threats, serious death threats against Jewish students at Cornell, and actual shootings and attempted murder of 3 Palestinian American students in Burlington, Vermont. We all want to express our outrage in House resolutions, which we've done more than 20 times as a House of Representatives, and numerous times even since October 7th. For example, on November 2nd, we passed House Resolution 798, which condemned all forms of anti-Semitism on college campuses, denounced any support for terrorist groups on campus, reaffirmed the free speech rights of Jewish students and faculty, and urged enforcement of federal civil rights laws to protect Jewish students against anti-Semitism. So why do we need this resolution? Well, the only thing new about it is that it would have the U.S. House of Representatives call specifically for the resignation of 2 college presidents, a call that has been slipped in at the bottom of page 2 of the resolution. This extraordinary passage comes close to being what the Constitution calls a bill of attainder, which is the unconstitutional imposition by Congress on a specific citizen or citizens of a criminal punishment or stigma by the Congress itself. Although this resolution is not a criminal punishment or stigma against specific citizens, it is undoubtedly a civil punishment and stigma against specific American citizens. How many of you would like the president of the college where you went or where your children go to be walking around with a congressional resolution telling them to resign? Everyone knows that this will be an academic scarlet letter and a professional death sentence for anyone carrying it around. Does anyone think that UPenn's President Liz McGill, who's already resigned in the face of Ms. Stefanik's ceaseless campaign to force her out, will ever be able to find another college presidency? Give me a break. Now, I hold no brief for the college president's overly legalistic, ethically tone-deaf answers awkwardly advanced in response to Ms. Stefanik's rapid-fire yes-no questions. It should not be difficult for anybody to say that in the age of rampant gun violence and lax Republican gun laws, which have put tens of millions of AR-15s into circulation in our society, anyone calling for genocide of the Jews or anyone else should be sent immediately a campus security detail to see if they pose the risk of harm to other people or if they need an immediate mental health exam. And if there's not an imminent threat, surely the call for genocide of the Jews by definition constitutes a hostile learning environment and should occasion aggressive disciplinary action. So where was the common sense on the part of the college presidents? But where is the common sense in the Congress of the United States of America? Calling for the resignation of private individuals at private universities would be a dramatic and unprecedented departure for the U.S. Congress, which has never before voted to tell a college president to resign. Before we affix this lifelong stigma, reproach, and dishonor on a private citizen, do you think perhaps we should offer them some kind of due process? The kind of due process that even George Santos got and that Donald Trump is getting all over America right now for his 91 federal and state felony charges? I request 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes.
Gentleman's recognized.
Should Harvard President Claudine Gay, who is the first Haitian American ever to serve in that position, and Sally Kornbluth, who is Jewish, get the chance to explain what they are actually doing to combat racism and anti-Semitism at their schools and what they have done in their lives and in their careers to oppose anti-Semitism and racism, which are the gateway to destruction of liberal democracy? Do we care about that? Or is this just a bunch of drive-by talking points? Is it relevant that the Harvard and MIT boards have made unanimous statements affirming the leadership of their 2 college presidents? Are we saying that their boards don't matter or they are indifferent to anti-Semitism? And the leaders of the Freedom Caucus know better than the Jewish president of MIT what anti-Semitism is? Now, I know these 2 were the presidents testifying before Ms. Stefanik, but are we sure that these 2 are even the worst in the country when it comes to bias and discrimination? Is this a one-shot deal, or, as Ms. Stefanik promises, is this just the beginning? Are we going to go through all the college and university presidents in America? And what about the CEOs of the businesses? Maybe they are not performing to her satisfaction either. And indeed, maybe there are college presidents who've looked the other way in not hypothetical cases of anti-Semitism and racism, but real cases of anti-Semitism and racism. What about them? Are we going to let them go, or are we going to go after them? Maybe we should determine who the worst are before we start using the resources of the House of Representatives to call for people to resign. Are there college presidents, by the way, who looked the other way when there was sexual abuse of college male wrestling team members, rape of students, or female gymnasts, or female soccer players? Are we interested in that now that we are superintending higher education in America? Now that we are the appellate review board for the colleges?
Has expired.
I'd like to request one more minute.
Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. Gentleman is recognized.
Additional 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, are we prepared to become the National Academic Appeals Panel for college presidents, coaches, and professors? Or is that perhaps best left to the universities themselves? Maybe it's that we just don't have a positive legislative agenda of our own to lower drug prices in America, to get aid to our democratic allies in Ukraine against fascist imperialist thug Vladimir Putin. Maybe we don't have anything real to do, so we decide instead to go around and start lecturing to college presidents and college boards all over America. In the absence of a real program for America, the majority is filling our hours with censures, expulsions, motions to vacate the speakership, overthrow their own leaders, and of course impeachment of President Biden. For what? For doing nothing wrong. Nothing wrong. That's all that they give us. And this cannibalistic instinct they've unleashed now turns on private citizens, academic leaders who will wear the scarlet letter A so they can have some more press conferences. I'm voting no on this resolution. I yield back and thank the chair.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized. Gentleman reserves.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
I am prepared to close too, and I believe the gentleman will close first.
Gentleman reserves.
How much time do I have left?
Gentleman has 4.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous
Gentlelady from North Carolina has 6 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, a group invited by the majority in 2018 to testify at a hearing examining the First Amendment rights on campus, and a group that authors the free speech ranking the majority cited several times at the committee hearing. I want to enter into the record a statement from December 8th entitled "University Presidents Were Right to Condemn Hate Speech and Defend Free Speech."
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, the letter, the statement goes that Gay was indeed correct on the calls for genocidal Jews were personally abhorrent and at odds with the values at Harvard. She is also correct that Harvard gives wide berth of free expression, even to views that are objectionable, and takes action when free speech crosses into conduct that violates our policies. Apparently, her sin was trying to explain freedom of speech to Congress and the American people. Supreme Court and federal law makes clear that speech in educational settings constitute harassment sufficient to result in expulsion or other discipline. It must be so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it effectively bars the victim's access to the educational opportunity. Had Stefanik and her colleagues taken time to familiarize themselves with the current law on free speech and frame their questions in terms of legal definition of harassment, they would have found common agreement with all three presidents. Mr. President, I condemn anti-Semitism. I condemn calls for genocide of Jewish people. I guess in this context that has to be repeated over and over again. I'm also concerned about the polarization of college campuses and the disturbing rise of discrimination and incidents on college campuses. And as I've noted, I'm skeptical of the majority's newfound concerns about anti-Semitism on college campuses because, as I said, in 2017, after white supremacists marched through the University of Virginia grounds shouting, "Jews will not replace us," I do not recall the same level of outrage. In fact, I note that the endorsement of the one who declared that there were good people on both sides. I wrote a letter to the majority requesting a congressional hearing at that time, and our calls went unanswered. Mr. Speaker, I concede that the university president's testimony last week, when taken out of context, fell into the First Amendment trap that when you suggest that freedom, that speech is protected, therefore you must agree with it. No. You can believe that speech is protected, but also believe that it is reprehensible. And calling for genocide of Jews is reprehensible in all contexts, but it could also be protected. Mr. Speaker, they answered the question the way Professor Fried said that he would have been professionally obligated to respond, but answering the question as posed should not warrant calls for resignation. We need to do everything we can do under the law to address anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, homophobia, and other forms of discrimination. This resolution fails to do anything to establish standards that can address reprehensible divisions in our society and on college campuses. So I oppose this resolution and urge my colleagues to also vote no. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm disappointed that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle think that Republicans need a lecture on free speech or freedom of religion. We do not need such a lecture on that, and we understand those concepts. Those are our first freedoms, and we are very keenly aware of those. Mr. Speaker, there are massive problems in post-secondary education in our country, and our committee is doing its best to address some of those problems and to do something about them. What we know, what we knew before the hearing, and what we know even more strongly after the hearing that we held last week is that Jewish students are facing a massive rise in violence on our college and university campuses. According to the Anti-Defamation League and Hillel International, 73% of Jewish students surveyed said they experienced anti-Semitism on campus this year. That number is up from 32% in 2021. Yes, yet college administrators, like the ones who testified before the committee last week, are not acting to protect students. Now's not the time for campus leaders to sit on their hands. The only way to salvage American academia and restore a safe learning environment for its students is by rooting out anti-Semitism and standing up against hate. I thank God that the Committee on Education and the Workforce is up to the task. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields.